I often tell people that three of the most common mental health conditions that we struggle with is actually the easiest to sort out. And they look at me with skepticism. And that's because the way we have grown to accept and understand the basis of these things is where the problem lies. The three conditions I'm talking about is depression, anxiety, and anger. Often people talk about anger management, which in itself is misleading, because you can't manage anger. You only bottle it up until it gets the better of you and it explodes in a way that you can't control. Depression is the other one. Anxiety is the third one. So why is it easy to sort out, but yet so many people struggle with it? So many people succumb to it and become almost like defined by it. The reason why we become defined by it is because we've grown to define ourselves based on how it is that we need others to accept us. Depression is the absence of hope, and that's not diminishing people's experiences in their struggles with feeling depressed. But the moment you say that you're suffering from something as opposed to you're experiencing something, suffering from means it's something that's happening to you. It's not something that you're experiencing yourself. That's the equivalent of thinking that someone's attacking you versus you are self-harming, right? That's, in a nutshell, what the difference is. So when we look at something from the wrong perspective, that wrong perspective leads us down the wrong path to look for solutions. And if we're heading down the wrong path to look for solutions, that becomes our next big challenge, because that's what I mean when I say that if you're not solving the right problem, you're creating new problems. So as an example, I often give people this example to give them an understanding of what's the difference between someone telling you what you must do versus someone helping you to understand why it is that you're struggling to do what it is that you want to do. And the example is a simple one. It's that assume you're in Johannesburg. If you're South African, you would know where that is. If you're not, look it up. You're in Johannesburg and you want to get to Cape Town. And you don't know how to get to Cape Town. So you look around you and you think, okay, here's someone that seems to know, so I'm going to ask them. And you ask them. But you don't know what it looks like, what someone who knows how to get to Cape Town, you don't know what they look like. So you're just going to listen to see who seems to know what they're talking about. So the person you approach tells you, sure, no problem. Hike all the way up to Cairo. And when you get to Cairo, find the coast. From the coast, swim down the east coast. And eventually you'll get to Cape Town. Are they correct? Yes, they are. Is that an effective way to get to Cape Town? No. Your objective was to get to Cape Town. Your objective wasn't to have some elaborate adventure in rural Africa and then swimming in the Indian Ocean with sharks. So what happens is that you eventually get to Cape Town, and when you get to Cape Town, you are weathered, you are beaten, you are scarred, and you've had all of these colorful experiences that you didn't sign up for. And when you get to Cape Town, you see someone that was also standing close to you when you were looking for directions to get to Cape Town. You say they're already there and they like chilled and having a good time. And you want to know from them, like, how did you get you so soon? Because you didn't delay at all in trying to get there. And they say, well, I just caught a plane. 2 hours later, I was there. And that's when the anger sets in, because like, why didn't that other person tell you? You could have just taken a plane. Why did you have to hike all the way up to Cairo? It sounds like a ridiculous example, but usually when you're on demonstrate a point, it helps to take it to extremes so you can see what's the impact of two different ways of approaching a problem. And that's the difference between the mainstream kind of thinking that is prevailing these days about how to deal with emotions and mental health issues. And I always say mental health in quotes, because the moment we say that it's mental health related, we imply that there's a mental illness by default, because you can't have a healthy state without understanding what an ill state looks like. I prefer to call it emotional well-being, but that's just me. So if you ask the wrong advisor and you don't know what you're looking for, you're going to take their advice blindly and you're going to believe that that's the only way to solve that problem. And because you're going to believe that's the only way to solve that problem, this is when you end up with colorful experiences in life that are entirely avoidable, unnecessary, and that you would rather not have had to learn the tough lessons about. And that's what happens when you go through life not knowing how to achieve what you want to achieve. Because we all know what we want. Everyone wants happiness. Everyone wants peace. Everyone wants fulfillment and gratitude and all of those wonderful things. We all want a comfortable life, a life of impact, a life of significance. And I mean, everyone wants it. There's not a single person that wakes up and says, I don't want happiness. I don't want peace. The only reason anyone would do that is if they want to prove a point because they're tired of getting people to understand how they are disrupting the happiness and the peace that we're looking for. So anyway, if you ask the wrong person for advice and you trust them just because they seem to know what they're talking about, you then don't know how to evaluate whether what they're telling you has merit or not. And that's the problem. If you don't know what you're looking for, like they say, if you don't know where you want to get to, any road will lead you there, right? So this is the same thing when it comes to understanding ourselves. If we're looking for other people to help us to understand ourselves, we're looking in the wrong place. So when you go to someone and you ask them for advice on how it is that you need to deal with depression and anxiety and anger, and you convince yourself that that's just who you are, that's just how you are, whatever it is, and you need to be able to cope with it and manage it and mitigate it and find tools to deal with it and all of that sort of thing so that it doesn't continue to spoil your relationships in your life. That's the equivalent of hiking all the way up to Cairo and then swimming down the coast to Cape Town. Depression, like I said, is the absence of hope. But it's not just any hope. It's the absence of hope about something improving or being the way you would like it to be, and that something is pivotal to the quality of your life, to what it is that you believe is important about life. And that's the other thing that we lose sight of, is that we don't realize how important something is to everything else that is going on in life. That we look at all of the other important stuff in life and we think, well, all of those things are good, and there's only this one small thing that I can't really talk about because I can't connect with why it's making me feel this way. So we assume that because we've got so much going well for us and there's only one small domain of our life that seems to be out of whack, then that means I must be suffering from depression, especially when they come up with these ridiculous brain scans and chemical imbalance theories that have been dismissed, by the way. Do the research. When they come up with those kinds of explanations for how you feel, you know with absolute certainty, you must know they don't know what they are talking about. Because they're not talking about the human experience anymore. They're talking about biology. We don't need to understand biology to know emotion because they're two completely different domains. If you're going to focus on biology, on anatomy, and you're going to think that that's going to give you answers into what makes you human, you're sorely, sorely mistaken. Because it's easy enough to tell what the tangible substance evidence is that we're looking at. But why it appears that way is the difficult part. So when it comes to emotions, when it comes to depression, if you don't understand, if you don't appreciate, or you don't have awareness of why something is important to you, why something is pivotal in your life, why it is that something makes everything else worth it or not worth it. If you don't recognize that, and you lose hope of that thing, usually an important relationship or space or a social circle or something that really means a lot to you, it signifies everything that means anything to you. When that is not the way you want it to be, or when you don't have the presence or the significance or the relevance in that space or the respect in that space that you want, then nothing else matters, because everything else was supposed to have been to serve that domain of your life. So, for example, if you are in a relationship with someone and that relationship feels unfulfilling, you feel invisible, you feel irrelevant, you feel disrespected, but for whatever reason, you can't leave that relationship. Or even if you do leave the relationship, it doesn't change the fact that what you wanted from that relationship, you had invested so much in it that you can't imagine your life without it. In a case like that, everything else, no matter how successful you are at work, no matter how amazing you are in your professional space or in a sporting athletic space or in aesthetics, in the way you look, your brand, your personal brand, all of that, none of that will matter. Because what it is that you are looking for the most fulfillment from is not there. And if that's not there, why should anything else matter? And that's when we go out looking for distractions. And the distractions become living loud. It's risky lifestyles. It's risky life choices. It's addictive behaviors. And then we think that we're addictive in nature, or we have addictive personalities, and it's rubbish. You don't have an addictive personality. That's absolute nonsense. And we'll talk about addiction another day, hopefully. But the point is that if you don't realize what you're trying to avoid, what you're trying to cope with, what you're trying to numb in your mind, you'll convince yourself that you need to cope with it. You'll convince yourself that the only way you're going to be able to handle any of these things is by having this coping mechanism or this tool set or the support structure that you need so that they can help you when you get into that state. So let's go back to the depression thing. If it's the absence of hope, it means that in your mind, you've exhausted all permutations, all variables, all scenarios and possible solutions about how it is that you could get it to work out the way you want it to work out. You wanted someone to see you a certain way and they just don't see you that way. And you don't know how you're going to ever be enough for anyone else, because if this person doesn't accept you, then who else is going to accept you, etc., etc., etc. That's what causes us to then lose hope, because the solution seems impossible to achieve. However, what we need to understand when it comes to any problem in life is that the only problem you cannot solve is the problem of death. Death will arrive at some point. Whether you have a healthy life, a safe life, a reckless life, whatever it is, at some point, the one thing we are all guaranteed is that we will die. So, apart from death, every other problem has a solution. And the only time we cannot solve a problem is if we don't understand the problem well enough. We'll understand what it is that the problem is presenting to us, but we won't understand what is creating the problem. And if you don't understand what is creating the problem, then your solution, your approach towards resolving it is going to be ineffective. You might be able to resolve or address some aspects of the problem, but other aspects of the problem will remain out of control or out of reach for you to be able to change it. And that's what happens, is that when we lose sight, or when we become convinced rather, that our ability to be able to change our circumstance is limited or impossible to overcome, we don't have that ability to overcome those limitations of ours, that's when we lose hope. We lose hope because we have no reason to believe that that important domain of our life is ever going to be the way we would like it to be. And that's where depression sets in. So it starts out with disappointment because of betrayal, because of heartbreak, because of failure at something, whatever it is. And the disappointment, then if we try to remedy it and if we don't remedy it, we can't successfully resolve it. That disappointment then turns to despondency, like this is starting to look really bad. And then the despondency eventually sets in further until it becomes depression, where we give up hope of it improving or changing or being the way we need it to be. That's where depression comes from. So when you feel in that state, when you feel overwhelmed by this hopelessness, what you need to consider is that there are assumptions you're making about the reality that you're dealing with, where those assumptions are incorrect. Those assumptions are founded on a perspective that might not be fully informed. And then gaining fresh perspective, fresh insight, understanding, that's what's important. So if someone comes along and tells you this is what you must do to get out of your depressed state, they are creating more problems for you, because the what is not going to answer the why. And it's the why that is more important. When we understand why, we can then choose what we want to do with that. We can choose whether we want to become more effective and more competent in being able to deal with that why, or we can choose to accept it for what it is because now we understand why, and then we just move on and we look out for that next time around. So one of the things, for example, within the context of depression and relationships in that we don't consider about the why is why would someone have treated us that way? And we automatically assume it's because we weren't important enough to them. If only we were more significant, if only we were able to get through to them, if only we were X, Y, and Z. And the focus is then on what was it about us that didn't give them enough reason to want to be better than that towards us. And that's one of the distractions that we have, where we assume that they did what they did. They betrayed, disappointed, failed, rejected, whatever it is. They failed us because of who we are to them. Meanwhile, if we don't have that self-awareness and we don't have understanding of what they were dealing with, then we won't ever consider why it is that they might have been grappling with something that our expectation or need from them might have provoked their demons, their insecurities, their sense of inadequacy, or whatever it is. And the moment that happens, we then see them behaving badly towards us, and we assume it's because of what they think of us, rather than considering that it might be that what we need, which is legitimate and justified and entirely healthy, might just be something that they don't know how to deal with. And when you start considering it from that perspective, you start seeing the human in the other person, and you see what their human struggle is, so that you don't make their struggle about you. And vice versa. When someone else can't show up for you, you don't focus entirely on why they can't show up for you. You focus on your struggle and why it is that it's so important for that to be fulfilled by them. That's how you then start working through depression. And this is especially true when it comes to our understanding of our relationship with our parents. There's a lot of fixation these days on childhood trauma, but it's not necessarily trauma. There's a place for trauma. I'm not denying that it happens. But what we take from that, what we take from our childhood experiences, and what we take from the time that we did or didn't have with our parents, that's what shapes how we feel about ourselves. And if we don't look at our parents as humans in that context, then automatically what happens is then we're always going to consider why it is that we, as innocent children, were not afforded more care or consideration or effort from our parents. And that's what then shapes our sense of self and what we go out looking for in life and what we want to be better than and all of those sorts of things. So if we don't understand that about our parents, if we don't see the human behind them, because they were also playing a role with a human struggling behind that role to be able to show up for us, if we don't consider that side of it, we won't have a full, healthy perspective on what the overall problem was about a childhood experience with them or experiences with them. And as a result of that, how we experience them will then give us reason to believe that it's because of what they thought of us or how we weren't important to them, etc. And then that starts another whole problem, because more often than not, in fact, every single time I've encountered anyone who came for assistance in parenting and marriage, they set out to want to be different or better than their parents in some way or another, parent or parents, one or both. And there's nothing wrong in itself with that, because we look to others and we can see, well, okay, I want this for myself, or I don't want that for myself. And then that becomes your aspirational goal. However, what you lose sight of is that just because you know who you don't want to be doesn't mean you know how to go about achieving who you want to be. And that's where things become complicated. So when you don't know how to achieve who you want to be, and you keep trying and you keep trying and you keep trying and you're failing, and then the probability of you becoming successful at it diminishes, it reduces every single time you put in an effort and it doesn't work out the way you want it to work out, especially when it comes to being a partner or when it comes to being a parent. And you see it just keeps getting more and more difficult. Or even at the workplace, about your career success and getting the respect from your peers and things like that. What happens then is all of those times that it failed become the probability factor that you consider in your mind when you're looking to the future. So when you're then looking to embrace a new experience or to endeavor towards a new goal of some sort, the probability of failure that you're considering will increase your anxiety because you believe that the chances of you achieving it are that much less. So that's where anxiety comes from. Anxiety is looking to the future and seeing the probable outcomes that you believe is likely to happen, and then considering whether or not you are capable of mitigating that, overcoming that, dealing with that, rising above it. So our belief in our ability to deal with what we think might be the next outcome is what drives our anxiety. And that's based on what we learned from past efforts and experiences about it. Again, we get distracted by the fear of a probable outcome, and that's what causes anxiety. Now, if what you have to achieve or what is demanded from you is something you don't have a choice in, that's when the anxiety becomes really debilitating and can become full-blown panic attacks, because it's something that's too important for you to walk away from. It's something that is too daunting for you to embrace fully because you're doubting your ability to be able to do it or achieve it or even deal with it. But at the same time, you don't know how to navigate it because it's just overwhelming. And that goes into a full-blown panic attack. It's probabilities. It's the assumptions we're making about outcomes. It's the assumptions we're making about who we are and what we're capable of. All of those things feed those probabilities, which leads to anxiety or leads to depression. Where does anger come in? Look at how interestingly it all connects with anger. Like I've alluded to multiple times now, and I'll continue because it's something that we really need to change our perspective on when it comes to anger, is that anger is a defense mechanism. Anger is not a negative emotion. There's no such thing as a negative emotion. Your emotions either have relevance because of your understanding of things, or if it is potentially irrelevant or uncalled for, it's because you don't have a healthy perspective of why it is that you feel that way. But the fact that relative to your perspective, you have good reason to feel that way, that's what matters. And if someone comes along and tells you, stop feeling that way, can you see how stupid that is? You can't tell someone to stop feeling that way. You have to help them to understand why they feel that way. So when you go to therapists or counselors or coaches or whoever it is, and they tell you what you must do instead of helping you to understand why you're doing it, run, please, avoid them. They're just going to create new problems. They're giving you coping mechanisms and tools and exercises and solutions that worked in someone else's life but is not necessarily relevant to your life. That's what coping mechanisms are. We take someone else's solution, implement it in our life, it gives us some relief, and then we think, hey, cool, we got this. Until the situation changes, the coping mechanism fails, and then we got double jeopardy. Story for another day. But in fact, not necessarily another day, because that's exactly how, when the coping mechanisms fail, it then feeds that probability factor that we've been looking at that causes the anxiety. Because if I thought I had a handle on something and now suddenly something happens and I realize I don't have a handle on it anymore, it means that I'm never going to be good at this. And that I'm never going to be good at this, that's part of that victim mentality where we think of everything in absolutes. It will never change. It will never be okay. It will never work out for me. All of this absolutes where we think everything will always just be the way it is because we're fear-driven and we're in a victim headspace. And it's not blaming the victim and it's not shaming the victim. It's just recognize that that's where you're at. You're looking at yourself as being a victim of the circumstances around you. And because of that, you have no reason to believe that you'll be able to prevail. You'll be able to rise above it or champion your way through it. So that's what causes us to lose sight of what's important. So how does it feed into anger? Anger is a defense mechanism that demands that someone must see our relevance or our significance or see how it is that they're affecting us, because we don't want to be invisible. We don't want to be irrelevant, or we don't want them to take us for granted. You don't ever rage at someone who means nothing to you. And if you find yourself raging at someone who means nothing to you, it's because the way that stranger, like road rage for example, the way that stranger is behaving towards you, that feeling you get, not the way they make you feel, the feeling you get in response to what they're doing, feels the same as someone significant treating you badly. So if at work or even in your home space, you feel consistently disregarded or consistently disrespected. You feel invisible. And you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off. Them cutting you off implies that they didn't care about the fact that you had a right of way. If they didn't care that you had the right of way, that them not caring or appearing not to care is what you take as, so again I'm being disregarded, again I'm being treated like this, again I'm being ignored, or I'm treated like I'm invisible. And that feeling that resonates with all the other times in your life at that point that feels the same way is what comes rushing in, and that is what causes the road rage. And that's how you end up raging at a stranger who was possibly just legitimately distracted or was neglecting what it is they were doing on the road. They don't know you from anywhere. They had no reason to direct that effort at you personally. They were just distracted in their own way for their own reasons, not saying they were right. But because you took it personally, it's because the way you felt when they did that felt the same as how you felt when someone you cared about or someone who is important to you or has impact in your life treated you. That's where the anger comes from. So anger is our demand for significance when we believe we're insignificant. Now, anger itself is not what you need to control. You need to realize why you believe you're insignificant in the first place. Why you believe that someone's attacking you or there's a perceived attack directed at you in the first place. Because remember, if it's a defense mechanism, it means you're defending something. You're protecting yourself from something, right? So if you're protecting yourself from something, that from something means that you are perceiving an attack directed at something about you. And usually that's about your significance, right? Someone is undermining you, they're dismissing you, they ignoring what's important to you, what your rights are, what you have a relevant claim to, all of those sorts of things. So when you feel that this is what's happening to you, you then come out fighting because it's too important for you to allow them to get away with it. That's the narrative that drives our thinking. So because it's too important to walk away from what you just accept, and you also don't know how to change it in a beneficial, meaningful, peaceful way, constructive way, then the next best thing is to rage. Let them know that, listen, you're taking me for granted and I don't appreciate this. So you rage to demand significance. You better take me seriously or else. And that's where the rage and the anger comes from. And anger takes many forms. It's irritability, it's annoyance, it's frustration, it's spite, it's all of these things that people would say negative emotions and negative attitude and bad attitude and this and that. That's all forms of anger, because no one behaves badly if they feel appreciated. So if you feel appreciated, you're not going to behave badly. So if you're behaving badly, you need to consider whether you genuinely are not appreciated or is there something else going on. And if you are genuinely not being appreciated, you need to understand why it is that the other person might not appreciate something about you, or what it is that's distracting them, or maybe what's important to you is just genuinely not important to them, and you can't force people to buy into what's important to you. That's part of your drive to give them reason to appreciate why it's important. But if you have a low self-worth, if you have a low self-esteem, you're going to have no reason to believe that your effort in explaining something to them is something they're going to connect with. And that's why you then force compliance. You force legitimate claims for them to take you seriously, or for them to understand what's important to you, or how they're affecting you, etc., etc. And that's all because if who you are is not enough, if your belief about who you are is not enough, then you're going to rely on what you're associated with, or what you do, or what you have. So either your association with a certain kind of social structure, that could be a religious group, it could be a racial group, it could be a cultural group, whatever it is, right? Your association with something that you know they will respect is what you're going to draw on. Otherwise, you're going to rely on your resources. You've got the resources and the means to be able to make their life difficult, to withhold things from them, or to cause problems for them. And that's what you'll rely on, and then you pull that card out to respond to them. Or the other thing that you'll do is, if you have authority, or you have power that's given to you in lieu of the title that you carry with you, in that setting, then you'll use that as one of the things to get the better of them. And all of that is just shows of force, because who you are, you don't trust, is enough for you to be able to get through to them. And that's how anger then becomes a tool as opposed to a solution. Now, if anger controls you and you're trying to now do anger management, you got a problem. If you are mindful and you deliberately command the tone of anger, an angry tone or a stern tone, because you want to convey seriousness because someone is just not taking you seriously, different story. Because you are regulating your expression through anger as a means. But you then hold yourself accountable for how far you take it. Whether you're just going to raise your voice, are you going to use harsh words, are you going to use firm language, are you going to actually physically restrain someone if that's called for? So having the mindfulness about this is not something you can develop in the moment that you're actually feeling that way. It's something that is developed before you get into that moment. Because your emotional reaction to something is about your belief about who you are. It's not about your narrative, your dialogue, or your affirmations. It's about your belief. So in the moment that you believe you're significant, you won't have to think about whether you're significant or not. You'll just respond in a way that is going to be light and easy and amicable. But if you believe intrinsically that who you are is going to be taken for granted or is going to be ridiculed or something, then you're going to go in claiming your space, or you're going to go in defensively by default because you're looking for threats. And that's why self-worth is not a narrative. It's not a dialogue that you have with yourself. Self-worth is not about what you tell yourself, how you evaluate what your merits are and what your strengths and weaknesses are. That's not self-worth. Self-worth is your state of being, and it's revealed when you look back on how you dealt with certain things and you see whether you felt threatened or you felt composed or you felt positive about what you were trying to achieve with them, whatever it is. It's in hindsight that we can see where our self-worth is at, not in the moment. And that's the same with mindfulness. Mindfulness can't be developed in the moment. You're either distracted or you're not distracted. If you're distracted, you lose mindfulness. And the distraction then is what you have to consider resolving. You have to understand where the distraction comes from. What is it about that setting, that moment, that experience, that issue that you're dealing with? What is it about that you're distracted about from past experiences, or projecting into the future about what it is that you think is going to happen? So now you preemptively taking action about something that isn't actually happening. And that's how overthinking and mental clutter then distracts us from what it is that we're dealing with, and it causes us to create more problems rather than seeing solutions. So hopefully through that, you can see that this belief that I'm suffering from anxiety, or I'm suffering from depression, or I have anger management issues, I'm hoping that you will start realizing that that's not the problem and that's not at all what's happening. What's actually happening is that relative to your experiences in life, you've got in your mind, a legitimate reason to feel that way. And understanding what is the legitimacy of that reason to feel that way, that's where your solution lies. That's where your peace lies. That's where you can reclaim yourself and your self-respect. That's where you claim your dignity. That's where you claim your self-worth. Because you start understanding yourself as a human, not as a bunch of symptoms. And when you start seeing the human within yourself, it makes it possible for you to see others as humans, and that's where empathy and compassion comes from. You can't give what you don't have. If you don't see yourself with empathy and compassion, I don't mean deliberately trying to empathize and be compassionate. No, if it's deliberate in that way, it's something that you're forcing. It means that you still don't believe it. It has to be a natural disposition. But the way it develops into a natural disposition is through your perspective that changes. You have to see things differently to deal with it differently. Otherwise, you're just employing another tool or another coping mechanism to try to do it the right way. And that's not sustainable. That eventually wears you out. And the biggest problem we have in relationships is that we have practices and we have norms that are not sustainable to keep the relationship in a good space. So if someone's having a bad day and it's completely unrelated to the dynamics of the relationship, that bad day causes them not to show up the way they would need to show up for their partner. And we accept from time to time that, okay, they're having a bad day, so we give them space. We give them space. We give them space. But what if they didn't want space and they needed comfort instead? But we didn't feel as if we were adequate to comfort them, or we didn't feel as if it was our responsibility to comfort them. And that's where the transactions start up in a relationship. And then things get complicated in the relationship, all because our sense of self is not where it needs to be. So if you don't have a healthy sense of self, if that sense of self is not established in the quiet moments, rather than in the middle of drama or chaos, then you won't know what it is that you have as impact on the people around you, because you're constantly going to be focusing on what people need to do for you, or what are they doing towards you, and you will be assuming that they're doing that because of who they think you are to them, rather than what it is that they're grappling with. So I guess in a nutshell, what I'm trying to get across today is that be careful about being defined by the labels that people, society, mainstream mental health, wisdom might be framing you as. If you believe you are suffering from depression, you lose agency, you lose your ability to regulate and choose and understand why you feel depressed. If you feel you're suffering from anxiety, the same thing happens. You will then be getting more anxious, because now you're anxious about the anxiety you're feeling and how that's going to trip you up about something that's important. And then you look for unhealthy coping mechanisms, which is usually the form of medication and things like that. And then the moment you start looking at that as a long-term solution, you create more problems, because then you've got side effects and you've got other things that it distracts you from, and it creates blind spots, because now you believe that you are suffering from something. You don't believe it's something you're doing, or an unhealthy perspective that you're maintaining that's actually creating the problem in the first place. Labeling emotions, labeling people because of their emotions is never a good idea. And the moment we stop doing that, we stand a better chance of seeing the human that's struggling rather than the behavior that we don't appreciate. I hope that helps. And if you want me to unpack a specific part of today's discussion, because we covered a very broad array of things, please drop me a comment, and we'll take it up in the forthcoming episodes. Take care. I'm Zaid Ismail, and I hope that was of benefit to you.